Imagine waking up tomorrow and having nothing to wear. No shirts, no pants, no shoes, no jackets. For most of human history, clothing was not about fashion, trends, or looking good. It was about survival. Thousands of years ago, humans had to protect themselves from freezing temperatures, strong winds, scorching heat, and rough environments. The first clothes were simple. Animal skins, fur, leaves, and other natural materials were used to cover and protect the body. But something interesting happened. As humans became better at hunting, crafting tools, and making materials, clothing began to change. People learned how to cut skins into different shapes. They learned how to tie them together, and eventually, they learned how to sew them. Clothing was becoming more practical, but it was also becoming something more. It was becoming part of human identity. Early humans probably did not think about clothing the way we do today. There were no fashion stores, no designers, and certainly no fashion magazines. A piece of clothing had one main purpose: keep you alive. In cold regions, thick animal fur could help protect the body from freezing temperatures. In warmer environments, lighter materials could provide protection from the sun while allowing the body to stay cooler. And clothing also offered protection from the environment itself. It could help protect against scratches, insects, and rough terrain. But creating clothing was not easy. Animal hides had to be processed before they could be used. They had to be cleaned, dried, softened, and shaped. Early humans also needed sharp tools and strong fibers to connect pieces together. Over time, these techniques became more advanced. And once people could make clothing that fit the body better, clothing became more comfortable and useful. But humans were not finished. The next step would completely change the history of clothing. Fabric. Instead of relying only on animal skins, ancient societies began producing textiles from plants and other natural fibers. One of the most important materials was linen, and few civilizations used linen as effectively as ancient Egypt. Egypt's hot climate made lightweight clothing extremely useful. Linen could be woven into breathable fabric and shaped into garments suitable for the environment. But clothing in ancient Egypt was not only about staying cool, it could also show social position. Ordinary people generally wore simpler clothing. The wealthy could afford finer materials, more elaborate garments, jewelry, and accessories. And at the top of society stood the royal family. The clothing of the pharaohs was designed to communicate power. Gold, fine textiles, elaborate headdresses, and jewelry helped create an image of wealth and authority. So clothing had already begun to change. It was no longer just protection. It was becoming a visual language. Thousands of kilometers away, another clothing tradition was developing. In ancient Greece, garments could appear surprisingly simple. Large pieces of fabric were wrapped, folded, and fastened around the body. The result was elegant, practical, and adaptable. Instead of creating complicated garments with dozens of separate pieces, Greeks could use the shape and movement of the fabric itself. The Romans later developed their own clothing traditions, and clothing became an important way to communicate status. The famous Roman toga became strongly associated with Roman citizenship and public life. Different people could be recognized by what they wore. Clothing was becoming a social signal. You could look at someone and immediately have clues about who they were, where they belonged, and how much power they had. This idea would become even stronger in medieval Europe. After the fall of the Roman Empire, European clothing changed dramatically. During the Middle Ages, society was divided into clear social classes, and clothing often reflected those divisions. Peasants usually needed clothing that was practical, durable, and affordable. Nobles had access to more expensive fabrics, brighter colors, decorative details, and better tailoring. Trade also played a major role. Merchants traveled across Europe and beyond, bringing new fabrics, dyes, and luxury materials into different regions. As trade expanded, wealthy people gained access to materials that ordinary people could not easily afford, and this created a new idea: fashion as status. The clothing you wore could tell everyone around you how wealthy or powerful you were. But this was about to become even more extreme. During the Renaissance, clothing became increasingly elaborate. European courts became centers of fashion. Wealthy men and women wore multiple layers of fabric, detailed embroidery, expensive materials, and elaborate accessories. Clothing could become so complicated that getting dressed required help from servants, and appearance mattered enormously. The goal was not simply to look attractive. Clothing was a public display of wealth. A wealthy person could use expensive fabric and intricate decoration to show everyone that they belonged to the upper class. Fashion had become an important part of power. But eventually, another force would transform clothing forever: technology. By the 18th century, fashion among European elites had reached extraordinary levels. Women's dresses could become extremely wide. Sleeves, skirts, and decorative elements could require enormous amounts of fabric. Hairstyles became increasingly elaborate, and for wealthy people, getting dressed could take a significant amount of time. Clothing had become almost theatrical. But while the wealthy were displaying their status, something much bigger was happening in the world. Machines were beginning to change how things were produced, and clothing would be one of the industries most affected. The Industrial Revolution changed clothing more than almost anything that came before it. Machines could produce textiles much faster than people working by hand. Factories could manufacture large quantities of fabric and clothing. Production became faster. Costs began to fall, and clothing slowly became available to a much larger part of society. This was a huge change. For thousands of years, clothing had often been made locally and by hand. Now, clothing could be produced on an industrial scale. Fashion was becoming more accessible, and this created the foundation for the modern clothing industry. But the biggest changes were still ahead. The 20th century transformed fashion at an incredible speed. Instead of one style lasting for generations, new styles could appear within decades and eventually within years. The 1920s brought dramatic changes. Women's clothing became more relaxed, and shorter dresses became increasingly popular. Fashion was beginning to reflect changing ideas about society and women's lives. Then came the middle of the century. World wars, economic changes, new technologies, and changing social roles all influenced what people wore. After the Second World War, fashion continued to evolve. The 1950s became associated with polished and carefully structured styles. Then came the 1960s. Young people increasingly began using clothing to express individuality and challenge traditional ideas. The 1970s brought even more experimentation. Different subcultures developed their own styles. Music, youth culture, and fashion became closely connected, and by the 1980s and 1990s, clothing was being influenced by television, movies, celebrities, music, and eventually the growing global media industry. Fashion was no longer controlled only by kings, nobles, and wealthy elites. It belonged to everyone. Today, clothing can travel around the world faster than ever. A trend can appear in one country and become popular internationally within days. Social media has accelerated this process even further. People can discover new styles instantly. Designers can reach global audiences, and ordinary people can influence fashion themselves. But modern clothing has also created new challenges. The ability to produce enormous amounts of clothing quickly has created a huge global industry. Fast fashion allows people to buy inexpensive clothes and replace them frequently. At the same time, questions about waste, working conditions, and environmental impact have become increasingly important. So the history of clothing is not finished. It is still being written. Think about how strange the journey really is. Thousands of years ago, humans wrapped themselves in animal skins simply to survive. Then came woven fabrics. Ancient civilizations used clothing to show culture and social position. Kings and nobles turned fashion into a display of power. Factories transformed clothing into a mass-produced product. And today, fashion can spread around the world with the click of a button. What started as protection from the cold became something much bigger. Clothing became a way to communicate wealth, a way to show identity, a way to express rebellion, a way to belong, and sometimes simply a way to stand out. So the next time you choose what to wear, remember, the clothes on your body are part of a story that began thousands of years ago, a story about survival, culture, technology, wealth, and human creativity. And that story is still changing.